So today I'm going to look at an interesting issue in epistemology. It's called the problem of the criterion. This is a problem that has some history, but is now most associated with philosopher Roderick Chisholm. Here's the basic idea. Knowing what's true, on one hand, requires having some procedure or method or criterion for distinguishing true beliefs or appearances from false beliefs or appearances, or for determining the reliable sources of truth. After all, we have a variety of beliefs, about the world and so on. Some of those are true, some of those are justified, and so on. How do we determine which are justified and which are true and which are, merely seem to be the case, or which we're not justified in believing? The thought is that requires some principle or some sort of criterion for distinguishing them in this way. However, on the other hand, so the thought goes, having some such criterion or procedure or method for distinguishing true beliefs or appearances from false beliefs or appearances requires knowing some truths, right? Since there would be no way to verify that a criterion was a good criterion unless you could test it against truths you could sort of know independently, right? To see that your criterion delivers the right results. Since knowing which of our beliefs are knowledge requires having some procedure for counting them as such, and having some such criterion requires having some knowledge, we cannot have either, and skepticism looms. Rewording slightly, Chisholm frames the problem with the following two questions. Question 1, which of our beliefs count as knowledge? And question 2, what are the criteria for determining which of our beliefs count as knowledge? Framed this way, this is a question about our knowledge, right, and determining which of our beliefs count as knowledge. The questions are therefore meta-epistemological, i.e. questions about knowledge. In other words, we might ask, is the proposition, I know that I have hands, true? Right, that's a particular knowledge attribution, in this case, to myself. And how would we go about determining whether it is true? Well, this is an, I think, accurate way to interpret Chisholm on his initial exposition of the problem of the criterion. There is also a more general version of the problem, which we might also interpret Chisholm as, at times, suggesting. The more general version concerns truth more broadly, not merely truths concerning our knowledge. On the more general problem, the questions can be phrased as follows. Question 1, which propositions are true, or what is true? And question 2, what are the criteria for determining which propositions are true, or for determining what is true? This will not be our final construal, however, since it's still missing a component of the problem which is not always made very clear. As Andrew Kling notes in Posing the Problem of the Criterion, the trick, of course, is not simply to answer which statements are true, but to provide an answer which has positive epistemic value. We want statements which are true, known, justified, or some such thing. Not just any answer to which statements are true will do. We want a good answer. And he adds, we want a criterion with positive epistemic value. Page 267. Following Kling, I will use the term good to indicate these features, positive epistemic value, justification, or whatever other normative features we're looking for. This will require further discussion, but for expository purposes, I'm going to continue to use this terminology for now, and we'll revisit it later in the video. We can now update the questions as follows. Question 1, what are the good beliefs? And question 2, what are the good criteria for determining good beliefs? Then, so the problem goes, having good beliefs requires having good criteria for determining good beliefs, and having good criteria for determining good beliefs requires good beliefs. And the worry is, again, since each answer is required for the other, neither is answerable. We could answer neither question. Importantly, if we cannot have good answers to what are the good beliefs, then we cannot have knowledge. Well, I think this final version best captures the spirit of the problem. In the course of this video, I will cover some variations. Now, I've said that each answer is required for the other. Well, why is this? Well, to repeat, although in a more general context, the thought is that having a good answer to what are the good beliefs will just involve having some good way to discern the true from the false, or discern the good beliefs from the beliefs that are not good, right? That will just amount to a good criterion of truth. A good answer simply involves having a justification of this sort, so the thought goes. And similarly, on the other hand, having a good answer to what are the good criteria for determining good beliefs will involve having some good answers to what are the good beliefs, so that we can verify that the criterion delivers the right results. If we had no independent access to the good beliefs, then on what basis would we have determined that a given criterion is a good criterion rather than a bad one? Because for all we know, it could be just delivering the wrong results, and we're merely thinking that is a good criterion. In other words, to be justified in thinking that is a good criterion, that is, to have a good answer to what are the good criteria of truth, we need to have a sort of support for that criterion as a good criterion in the form of verifying that it gives the right results. And that would require having independent access to the good beliefs or the truths. That's the basic idea anyway. And so, with these two things in mind, the conclusion is that while having a good answer to each question depends on having a good answer to the other, the worry is that we can't really have a good answer to either. And we're going to come back to these issues, but at this point, it will be useful, I think, to state a version of the skeptical argument based on the problem as so far discussed. Andrew Kling, in that aforementioned article, frames this argument as follows, calling it, as I will now, the master argument. It goes like this. Premise 1. Good beliefs depend upon an independently good criterion of truth. Premise. 2. We can have no independently good beliefs. From 1. 3. A good criterion of truth depends upon independently good beliefs. Premise. 4. We can have no independently good criterion of truth. From 3. 5. We can have no good beliefs. From 1 and 4. And finally 6. We can have no good criterion of truth. From 3 and 2. The inferences from 1 to 2 and from 3 to 4 are fairly straightforward. If a belief being good depends on there being an independently good criterion of truth, then any good belief isn't independently good. It depends on said criterion, right? And this applies as well to the inference from 3 to 4. Okay. How might we respond to this argument? Well, the positions that Chisholm thinks exhaust the possible responses to the problem of the criterion are what he calls particularism, Methodism, and skepticism. I'll explain these positions, starting with skepticism, actually. So first, although Chisholm doesn't mention this, as far as I know, there are two general sorts of skeptical responses here. The first is what we might call academic skepticism, or as I would prefer, epistemological nihilism. This sort of skeptic thinks that the argument is sound, or at least that the premise 5 is true. On this view, we have all sorts of beliefs, but none of them are good. We don't actually know anything, right? Now, some might worry that academic skepticism is incoherent in some way. For example, Howard Sankey, writing on this problem, said that academic skeptics incoherently assert that knowledge is known to be impossible. But this is a mistake, I think, since the academic skeptic can merely assert that nothing is known or that knowledge is impossible, and not assert that this is known. In fact, they would just deny that it's known, right? Because they don't think anything is known, including their belief in skepticism. Anyway, the second general sort of skeptical response here is called Pyrrhonian skepticism. The Pyrrhonian skeptic actually withholds judgment on the argument, on the truth of the premises and the truth of the conclusions. In fact, they withhold judgment on anything and everything. They have no beliefs at all. And while this is a approach, if you want to call it that someone can have in response to these sorts of problems, I'm not really going to focus on it very much here. And so, as I mentioned, skepticism, I'm going to really be talking about the skeptic who thinks that the argument is sound, or at least that the conclusions are true. A second position that Chisholm identifies is what he calls particularism. And this is actually ultimately the position that he will take himself. The particularists will deny the first premise in the argument, saying that we can have independently good beliefs without an independently good criterion of truth. And from those, we can infer good criteria of truth. The particularists might say, for example, look, my belief that I have hands, that 2 + 2 = 4, that the earth is approximately spherical. These are just examples of good beliefs, and their goodness doesn't depend on them being developed by or according with some, good criterion of truth. They might accord with some good criterion of truth, but they don't. It's not required for them to have to be good. On this view, we might then test which criteria of truth get the right results. That is, agree with independent good beliefs. We can sort of check what's sort of in common between those independently good beliefs. Perhaps there's particular sources of information that seem to deliver the independently good beliefs. And from that, we can develop good criteria of truth. For example, suppose that we find that the independently good beliefs accord well with some empiricist criterion. Well, we might then conclude that that empiricist criterion is a good criterion of truth. So again, the particularist thinks that no, the way out of this problem is to say we do have particular objects of knowledge, or have sort of these independently good beliefs. Their goodness doesn't depend on them according with or being developed with some independently good criterion or some criterion of truth. They just are good beliefs. There are things that we know. And from that, we can perhaps develop or come to know various good criteria of truth. So that's particularism. The third position that Chisholm identifies is what he calls Methodism. The Methodists, on the other hand, denies the third premise in the argument, saying that we can have independently good criteria of truth without them depending on independently good beliefs. And from those we can infer good beliefs, perhaps. So the Methodist might say, for example, look, beliefs developed in accordance with these norms of inquiry XYZ, those are good, and those that do not accord with those norms are not good. That's a good criteria of truth, right? This, because it's going to tell us which of our beliefs are good and which are not good, right? It's sorting them in this way. And the idea is that we don't need to have some access to the independently good beliefs in order to have an independently good criterion of truth like this. Its goodness, in other words, does not depend on independently good beliefs. And so on this view, we might then use the good criteria, should we have one, to develop good beliefs. For example, suppose we find that the independently good criterion is an empiricist criterion. We might then start developing other beliefs that accord with this criterion, and they are good beliefs because they accord with it. All right, so that's Methodism. Again, the Methodist thinks that we can have some method, right, independently of having good beliefs, some method for distinguishing the good beliefs from the false, from the bad beliefs, for distinguishing the true from the false. Some criterion that would deliver those results, and having that criterion doesn't depend upon having sort of independent access to the truth or to which beliefs are good and which are not. All right. I want to ask two questions at this point. First, are the three positions described, skepticism, particularism, and Methodism, actually all distinct? And second, are they exhaustive? Like, do they exhaust all the possible options we can have on this problem. In response to this problem. On the first question, the worry is, well, one worry that we might have is that all of the positions, or at least two of them, collapse into particularism. Don't skepticism of the non-Pyrrhonian sort and Methodism just assume that there are independently good beliefs, be it the premises of the previously stated argument, or the belief that some criterion of truth is good, or the belief that we cannot have independently good beliefs or independently good criteria of truth. Aren't those all just assumed as independently good beliefs by both of those views? I don't think so. So for the skeptic can maintain that their belief in the premises is, like all of their other beliefs, not good. They don't know that the argument is sound, they merely believe it. This is entirely consistent and potentially not even self-undermining, although we might return to this when we examine goodness more carefully. On the Methodist, well, being a Methodist, having and employing some criterion of truth, doesn't require having the good belief that it is a good criterion of truth. Moreover, they might think that they do have the good belief that it is a good criterion of truth, but that the goodness of that belief is epistemically posterior to the criterion in question. In other words, it being a good criterion of truth does not depend upon them having the good belief that is a good criterion of truth. To answer the first question, yes, I think the three positions are all distinct. I mean, someone might worry as well that that particularism might devolve into a sort of Methodism. If you think that, well, didn't we just describe some method for figuring out the good criteria of truth and so on and how that could be then applied to figure out more of the good beliefs and the truths. That's not correct. What's epistemically prior in this case is the good beliefs. We could use those to develop good criteria of truth and then use those criteria of truth to further develop good beliefs. But what's ultimately prior, epistemically speaking, here is the independently good beliefs. And that is that's not compatible with Methodism. The second question might be more controversial. Are these positions exhaustive? Or is there some other possible response or responses, which isn't just a version of one of the others? One position that is sometimes forwarded as an alternative is called Coherentism. The coherentist, like the skeptic, agrees that we can have no independently good beliefs or independently good criteria of truth. That is, they affirm premises 2 and 4 in the argument. However, unlike the skeptic, they reject 1, 3, 5, and 6. So, accordingly, the coherentist rejects the particularist view of the epistemic priority of good beliefs. They also reject the Methodist view of the epistemic priority of good criteria of truth. And they also reject the skeptic's view that we cannot have either good beliefs or good criteria of truth. What the coherentist claims is that they can develop good beliefs and good criteria of truth by starting with some beliefs and criteria or others, right? We start somewhere. They don't have to be good at the start, but we can use them to develop and balance them against each other until our attitudes form a sort of consistent, mutually supporting system. This is using Andrew Kling's phrasing from the same article. So we have sort of a way of coming to good beliefs and good criteria of truth, even though we can't really have independently good criteria of truth or independently good beliefs. There is an immediate worry, however. Isn't coherentism so described just a form of Methodism? After all, the coherentist has this procedure for developing good beliefs and good criteria of truth, and that procedure looks an awfully lot like a criterion of truth. However, we have to be careful here. If the coherentist maintains that this procedure is an independently good criterion of truth, then yes, they would just be a Methodist. But I don't think this assumption is required or entailed by their view. They might just accept this as a procedure for coming to good beliefs and good criteria of truth, without assuming that this criterion is a good criterion of truth. The approach is therefore not a form of Methodism, since it does not involve the assumption, nor does it entail the requirement, that we can have independently good criteria of truth. That's not to say that coherentism resolves the problem, to be sure. The point is that it's a response distinct from skepticism, particularism, and Methodism. Another way to see, again, that it is really distinct is by noting that it disagrees with at least one of the claims characteristic of each of those other positions. And it's not inconsistently disagreeing, right? It's not disagreeing, but on the other hand, still committing to it. It really does not have to collapse into one of those other views. Are there other possible positions one could take in response to the problem? Well, one way to think about this is to think about the possible responses to the argument, right? What are the sort of combinations of attitudes we can have, consistent combinations of attitudes we can have on those premises? And so the non-Pyrrhonian skeptic affirms that the argument is sound. The particularist affirms 3 and 4, but denies 1, 2, 5, and 6. The Methodist affirms 1 and 2, but denies 3, 4, 5, and 6. The coherentist affirms 2 and 4, but denies 1, 3, 5, and 6. I mean, the stickler might note that that's necessary but not sufficient for coherentism. That's fine. I'm not trying to be super precise in how I'm categorizing these responses here. Anyway, this clearly does not exhaust the possible options. For one, none of the mentioned positions affirm that we can have good beliefs, but rejects that we can have good criteria of truth. Perhaps this isn't a popular position, but it's an alternative, right? This view, which we might call a sort of skeptical particularism, I don't know if there's a name already for it, is like particularism in that it does maintain that we can have independently good beliefs, but agrees with the skeptic and disagrees with the particularist that we cannot have good criteria of truth. Right? And because it's disagreeing with the kind of claim characteristic of particularism here, it isn't a form of particularism. Similarly, we can have the reverse, the view that we can have independently good criteria of truth, but no good beliefs. I'll call that position skeptical Methodism. And it might not be as crazy as you might think it sounds, because what if we think that the independently good criteria of truth are just such that we never satisfy them? We can never use them to develop good beliefs, perhaps because it's too complicated or outside of our capacity for some reason or another. That could be a view that someone could have. Now, another response, if we are counting it as a response, would be to not even grant that the premises are well formed. For one, we might worry that it's not clear what is meant by good when we are talking about good beliefs or good criteria of truth. And that the problem of the criterion stated in this way is either unclear or ill-formed. Right? What does good mean? And I'm going to call this response non-cognitivism. All right. So I want to summarize the positions that I've mentioned thus far. 1, affirm 1 through 6, non-Pyrrhonian skepticism. 2, affirm 3 and 4, but deny 1, 2, 5, and 6, particularism. 3, affirm 1 and 2, but deny 3 through 6, Methodism. 4, affirm 2 and 4, but deny 1, 3, 5, and 6, Coherentism. 5, affirm 3 and 4 and 6, but deny 1, 2, and 5, skeptical particularism. 6, affirm 1, 2, and 5, but deny 3, 4, and 6, skeptical Methodism. And reject that all the statements are clear and well-formed. That is, think that at least some of them are unclear or ill-formed. That's non-cognitivism. Now, this doesn't exhaustive conceptual possibilities. Right? There are other consistent attitudes that one could have in response to the argument that doesn't collapse into one of these. Nevertheless, I'm not going to explore this further here. The general point is that there are a variety of other responses to the problem of the criterion, not merely the three that Chisholm lists: skepticism, particularism, and Methodism. To be clear, again, it's not that these are just variations of the initial three, since all of the others each reject at least one claim characteristic of the initial positions, and vice versa. At this point, we might consider what's wrong with any of the non-skeptical responses. The main problem, according to Chisholm, is that there's no non-question-begging way to decide between the various alternatives. Someone could be a particularist, but if they were to argue for their view, for example, they will just be assuming independently good beliefs in their argument, the existence of which is the very thing at issue and is not granted by the other views. As Chisholm remarks, what few philosophers have had the courage to recognize is this: we can deal with a problem only by begging the question. It seems to me that if we recognize this fact, as we should, then it is unseemly for us to try to pretend that it isn't so. The problem is that there's no neutral ground on which to resolve the issue, to decide which view is correct. Chisholm, again, adopted a particularist view. Right? That was his sort of response to the problem, to the questions. But he nevertheless granted that he has no non-question-begging way to show that the alternatives are incorrect. He just thinks that we can have independently good beliefs, but doesn't think that he can provide some non-question-begging argument against the alternatives. All right, I've said a fair amount thus far, so I'm going to summarize the problem as discussed. The problem of Criterion, again, is a problem of epistemology concerning knowledge. It has to do with this issue of developing and having epistemically good beliefs. And the worry is that to answer the question, what are the good beliefs, we must have an answer to what are the good criteria for determining good beliefs. But however, in turn, having a good answer to what are the good criteria for determining good beliefs requires having an answer to what are the good beliefs. The worry is that neither question can be answered without the other. And so we can't answer either. And moreover, the positions that we can have a good answer to one independently, or that we cannot, right, will amount to an unfounded assumption that will simply beg the question against the other views. Notably, this includes a skeptic, right, of the non-Pyrrhonian sort, because they have this belief that we cannot have independently good beliefs or independently good criteria of truth. And so the challenge, again, which Chisholm took to be unresolvable, is to provide a response which doesn't make any unfounded assumptions or beg the question against the other views. Someone could say, well, non-Pyrrhonian skepticism, that's a quote-unquote response of a sort. Yeah, I mean, that's one option that someone could take. But it's not the option that I'm going to take. And in fact, I don't think anyone, in fact, has ever taken that option. But that's a whole other kind of worms. Now, to respond to the problem. The first concern I have is, as I hinted back at the outset, that goodness here is unclear. Recall that Andrew Kling spoke about positive epistemic value, knowledge, justification, and so on. For me, however, this is far from obvious what's being said. In absent clarification, it seems like there's a fair amount of mystery. It was meant to be some robust normative notion, like there are these ways that we should believe or reason, and beliefs that we are really warranted, in some thick sense, in having, and things which count in favor of some belief. Then I'm, at this point, at a loss for what to say. I think there's this assumption among philosophers that there's something kind of substantive being said here, but I'm not convinced of that. Those who are familiar with some of my views on moral realism and normative realism more generally may have anticipated this attitude. Nevertheless, I'm happy to leave it open that some clarification is forthcoming, or that I'm just missing something that other people understand. I'm fairly doubtful, but I'll leave that possibility open. Let's suppose that on some clarification of the terms, something like a belief counts as good if it satisfies some condition C. For example, suppose that condition is formed on a Wednesday, right? Right. So then to say that a belief is good is just to say that it was formed on a Wednesday. Okay, so the good beliefs are those that are formed on Wednesdays. Now, presumably this would also allow us to infer a good criterion of truth. Form beliefs on Wednesdays, right? The beliefs that are formed on Wednesdays are good, and the ones that are not formed on Wednesdays are not good. And it sort of just falls out of what the statement means, right? What goodness means when it comes to belief and criteria, what the good beliefs and what the criteria will be. So will it fall out in that way no matter what the condition is? No. And so I want to look at a more realistic example, which I interpret some people who write on this as sometimes having in mind. We might suppose that the condition C of a good criterion of truth is that it reliably sorts the true beliefs from the false ones. A good criterion would just count most or all of the true beliefs as true, and most or all of the false beliefs as false. To be honest, that's sort of what I think some people have in mind when they just think of a good criterion of truth, right? Now, with that, if that's what's being asked, right, if that's what the question is assuming, how would I respond? Well, coming at these questions already with a variety of beliefs and means of developing beliefs, some more precise and deliberate than others, I would respond simply by citing which criteria I think are good in that sense, and what propositions I think are true, or the output of reliable criterion. I have views about which procedures, roughly, I think are generally pretty reliable in this sense. And so that's how I would answer. I'll come back a bit later on how I would answer in more detail, but as a broad description, that's like what I would say. You're asking me what I think a good procedure or criterion of truth is in this sense, like it reliably tells you what's true fairly, and doesn't count what's false as true. Well, I'm going to report these things that I think are reliable criteria in that sense. Okay, there are at least two relevant concerns that someone might have about this. First, but what about the goodness of the beliefs and inferences I've used to reach these conclusions? On that, I don't really have much more to say than I think that those are correct as well. What else could I say? Someone might contend that this won't do, as we'd still be caught in the wheel that the problem suggests. We need good criteria to determine good beliefs, and good beliefs to determine good criteria, and there's nowhere for inquiry to start, so to speak. But this is just a mistake. On the above construal of the goodness of criteria, we can come to conclusions about what criteria so qualify without first determining, or also determining, that the beliefs and inferences that I've used to draw these conclusions are themselves good. To answer or have beliefs about what the good beliefs or good criteria for beliefs are, I don't need to first or also answer or have beliefs about the goodness of those answers or those beliefs. The wheel, or regress, depending on how you frame it, never gets in motion. This is a point that's a bit tricky to express, so I'm going to repeat it. On the given notion of good as reliable, I have, or may have, beliefs and answers to the questions characteristic of the problem of the criterion. That is, answers to what are the good beliefs and what are the good criteria for determining good beliefs. But to do this, to have these answers, I don't need to have, although I may have, beliefs or answers regarding the further question of whether those beliefs or answers, that is, about the two questions, are themselves good. So suppose I have the belief and the answer that X is a good criterion of truth. It is a further question whether this belief or that answer is itself good. And I do not need to have an answer to that question in order to have the belief or to respond that X is as described. I might have that belief, but the point is that it's not required. And indeed, it's not even required that my belief or answer be good for me to have it. To consider this in light of the master argument, then, if the dependence here involves some logical or conceptual entailment, then premises 1 and 3 are false, as there just is no entailment. Recall, 1 said that good beliefs depend upon an independently good criterion of truth. No, I might. It's still a bit clear on what a good belief is at this point, but I might think that there are. First of all, I might have, and I might think that there are beliefs that satisfy the criterion of goodness, what it means for beliefs to be good, and I could think that without thinking that I have some, independently good criterion of truth. And similarly for the third premise. I might think that some criterion or other is a good criterion, but not think that it's being good depends on some independently good criteria of truth. So again, if premises 1 and 3 are such that dependence involves some logical or conceptual entailment, then they're false because there is no such logical or conceptual entailment. And that's again shown by the consistency of the alternative view. Now, here's a second worry for the rough response that I've provided here. It's fine enough for me to provide answers to the questions, but that's not really resolving the problem, because one of the key aspects of the problem concerns answering in a way which doesn't beg the question against the other views. Chisholm, after all, attempts to answer the questions as a particularist, but it's clear that he does not intend his response to be a solution to the problem, which he took to have no solution. Evidently, he intended that a solution, again, would not beg the question against the other possible responses. He says, we can deal with the problem only by begging the question, and that what I have said positively about the problem is not intended as a solution to the problem. On this point, I have to admit I'm a bit lost on what the issue is supposed to be. I agree, of course, that not everyone might agree with or come to agree with the remarks that I've made here, or the further remarks that I might make in response to the questions. It may also be that any argument I supplant in favor of my view will beg the question against someone with deep disagreements on the matter. But that's not really interesting. This is just a general feature of disagreement, right? Someone could always, on anything, have such strong disagreements that any support I provide, any argument that I provide them in favor of my view, will require some premise that they reject, and so beg the question against them. Accordingly, I just don't see any special relevance to this problem. By analogy, it would be strange to say that someone failed to solve some problem in mathematics simply because the proposed solution would or might be met by deep disagreement. They might, A, still solve the problem, and B, we might conclude that they have. Even if there's going to be some people that would never grant that, or for whom any argument in support of their solution would be begging the question against them. On the same token, we can come to conclusions regarding which criteria are good, in the above sense, reliably sort the true from the false, and what beliefs are good, perhaps that they're an output of such a criterion or satisfy some other condition yet to be specified. The fact that some or many people might be unconvinced of the attitudes I or we might have on those issues is no more worrying in this case than in the mathematical case. But if this sort of concern that really is just a concern about deep disagreement, it seems to me, is central to the problem, I suppose that I would just grant the point, right? If someone might have deep disagreements with my approach or with any of the remarks I made here. If that's what remains of the problem, it seems to be entirely mundane. Yeah, okay. People can be unconvinced no matter what I say. I agree. What does that have to do with what's so special about that as applied to these claims regarding reliable criteria of truth? And that's not the same. It's really just the same as if you applied it to any other claim, right? Like the mathematical theorem, or whether the sky is blue. Someone could always persist in deep disagreement and be unmoved by any argument supplanted in its favor. That's something I grant, but don't see the special relevance to the questions raised here. All right, so there's some other things to discuss. For one, what goodness involves might be something other or more than reliability. I'm not going to attempt to survey all the possibilities here, as I think my point generalizes. Clarify what is meant by good, right? And hopefully that what is meant by good, it sort of specifies to some degree what something that counts as good would have to satisfy, what sort of features it would have to have, right? Otherwise, what are you saying when you use the word good here? When I say that something is round, right, it's sort of built into the meaning of the term what the satisfaction conditions are, right? Now, hopefully that's true also in the case of the term good, right? If it isn't, then I'm not sure actually how to interpret it. But anyway, the first step is to clarify what that term means, right? Clarify what something would have to satisfy in order to count as good. And then if you do that, right, tell me what those conditions are, I'll tell you which, on my view, beliefs or criteria qualify, right, if I have a view. In some ways, the terms might be clarified. It might remain unclear what is meant or what the satisfaction conditions are. And so I just would remark that it's not clear what you're asking. On the other hand, it might be that on some clarification, I think that no beliefs or criteria of truth satisfy, right? That none of them actually qualify as good. Right? Perhaps I think that as a matter of fact, there are none. Maybe it's in principle, there can't be any, right? Because the conditions are unsatisfiable. Or I might think that there are some criteria or beliefs that are satisfied, and perhaps I have some attitudes on what those are. So, the specifics of my answer will just depend on how the term good is understood, right? If it's some primitive normative notion, well, again, that's a notion that I don't think I share. But if it's something else, specify what's meant by the term, and I'll tell you if I have an opinion, and I'm interested in telling you whether I think that those conditions are ever satisfied, and by what they are satisfied, if anything. Now, someone might ask, as I discussed earlier, for further details on how I might answer the questions. Well, for now, I'm still assuming that goodness means something like reliable, that it's reliable. I would describe, at least roughly, some of the procedures and heuristics I use or might use for developing and updating beliefs. I don't really have any strict procedure or set of procedures. That's not how I approach sort of developing my beliefs. But I take perceptual experiences under various interpretations is a decent guide to truth, as well as, tools like Bayesian reasoning, deductive and inductive inferences, and, working towards a sort of reflective equilibrium of my attitudes and perceptions. There's more that I could add, of course, and all of this is not so precise. And while it could be expanded upon and made more precise to some degree, that's not the point of my remarks here. For my purpose, this will do as a rough description of some of the methods for determining truth that I use and that I think are fairly reliable, right? So if you ask me, well, what's a reliable criterion of truth, right? What's a good criterion of truth where goodness means reliable? Those are some of the remarks that I would provide. These are ways I think I can sort of sort what's true from what's false in a fairly reliable manner. That's what I use. That's what I think is. That's how I might answer that question, in a brief, with a brief answer anyway. Now, again, there are just several questions someone might have in response to those remarks. First, well, why do I use these methods instead of others? Why do I think these ones are reliable and not others? The question is a bit ambiguous, but I expect that someone's, they're asking, they're trying to understand how I've come to the conclusion that these are reliable methods, at least compared to various other potential methods, right? Other potential criteria. But to some degree, I think this is a bit of a loaded question. I don't think that it was some inference or chain of inferences that I've made, at least consciously. I do think that these methods are generally reliable, but it's not as if necessarily this was the conclusion of some inquiry or chain of inferences. That I came to think that these methods are generally reliable. Well, it's a complex matter of my psychology and history, of which I do not claim to be an expert. I think I could say some things about it, but I'm not sure it's relevant. I can have these views about various criteria and truths without fully understanding how I came to have them. But this presents an immediate worry. If I didn't come to have these, beliefs by some good chain of inference or something like that, then doesn't that just mean that they aren't good, right? Aren't they just kind of arbitrary or random? The matter of some matter of my contingent psychology, which perhaps isn't even truth aimed. Well, I'm not sure that any of those descriptions are clear or apt. But whether the beliefs or criteria count as good will again just depend on what the conditions for goodness are. On some ways, we might understand the term good, they do qualify, and on others, they don't. And on the ways we might, on the understanding of good as reliable, I don't think it is a requirement. I don't have to reach them by some chain of inferences for them to be reliable. Because them being reliable just says that they, reliably sort the true for the false. I don't have to have in order to have a criterion like that, it doesn't also have to be the case that I came to that criterion by some good chain of inference. I just have to have the criterion, right? And it's also not a requirement for me to have the belief that they are reliable, right? So I could have a reliable criterion, but not assume that it's a reliable criterion, or believe that the means by which I came to that criterion are themselves reliable. I might believe that, right? But it's not a requirement. To the point, the reliability of the criterion does not depend on having some chain of inference or having some other, reliable or good beliefs or criterion that I use to develop them. Because reliability, goodness in this sense just means reliable, and reliable just means it, generally or invariably counts the true beliefs as true, and generally or invariably counts the false beliefs as false. That doesn't require, as a matter of conceptual or logical entailment, any of those other things. And so, yeah, I can just have this answer, have this view regarding reliable criteria, and not answer or have to answer these further questions of, how I came to those beliefs. I might have views about that, right? How I came to those beliefs. But the specifics of those answers, if I have them, the details there aren't really relevant. They wouldn't, rule one way or the other on whether the criterion itself is reliable. Okay, but third worry, someone might retort, okay, fine, you can have those beliefs and use those criteria. But what about someone else who disagrees? Aren't you just begging the question against at least some people by supposing that these criteria are reliable, and that we can even have reliable criteria, and that we can develop, that we can have beliefs that accord with them, and perhaps beliefs that are good in some sense yet to be clarified? This is just a return to the issue of disagreement, for which I, of course, do not have a general resolution. Some disagreements are intractable. I don't have an issue with that. I've said many things in this video, and someone could have deep disagreements with much or everything that I've said. Right? They might be unconvinced entirely, or they might have opposing views on everything. That's fine. Again, I'm not in the business of trying to convince everyone. I'm expressing my views. If someone understands what I have to say or finds it interesting and maybe comes to agree with some of it, that's great. If others are unconvinced or opposed, that's fine too. Again, my remarks here are not intended to be convincing to everyone who ever might watch this video. I will grant the point that the remarks that I've made might be met with deep disagreement, and any argument I might supplant in favor of my view might beg the question against those with deep disagreement. That's fine. I don't think that any dispute, any disagreement, is resolvable in principle by argument, right? Why would I assume that? That's nothing special about this case. It's just a general feature of disagreement in argument, it seems to me. All right, I can say more about the problem as it relates to disagreement, though, especially since Sextus Empiricus, the originator of this problem, one might argue, discussed disagreement extensively. He says in Outlines of Pyrrhonianism, in order to decide the dispute which has arisen out about the criterion, we must possess an accepted criterion by which we shall be able to judge the dispute. And in order to possess an accepted criterion, the dispute about the criterion must first be decided. And when the argument thus reduces itself, and thus to a form of circular reasoning, the discovery of the criterion becomes impracticable, since we do not allow them to adopt a criterion by assumption, while if they offer to judge the criterion by a criterion, we force them to a regress ad infinitum. And furthermore, since demonstration requires a demonstrated criterion, while the criterion requires an approved demonstration, they are forced into circular reasoning. That's from Outlines of Pyrrhonianism 2, section 2, page 21 to 22. Again, my response here should be fairly predictable. While the dispute need not reduce to circular reasoning, someone might present a non-circular argument that's not accepted by the other. Again, I don't think that there's going to be invariably some line of reasoning that someone can take to resolve any dispute, here or anywhere, right? We might face intractable disagreements over what's true, what the good beliefs are, what the good criteria of truth are, what the closest planet to the sun is, who's the most Pyrrhonian of them all, and so on, right? That's just a mundane fact about psychology and disagreement, not some deep philosophical insight, right? Again, yeah, if what a solution to the problem of the criterion must do is provide an answer, in particular a non-skeptical answer, which doesn't make any assumptions that would be or could be met by deep disagreements, by someone taking an alternative view, then I'll agree, there's no solution. But that's just to point out that on this matter, as with any other, there could always be someone that has an opposing view, but is such that any argument supplanted in favor of your view will require some assumption that they do not accept. Yeah, that's how deep disagreement can work sometimes. But that's not a general feature. That's not a feature special to this problem. It's a general feature of disagreement. I do want to cover another related issue, which is epistemological relativism. Listeners may be wondering whether my position is or consistent with relativism. Generally, epistemological relativism, hereafter just relativism, is the view that whether a belief counts as justified is relative to some context, to some set of kind of background epistemic norms, background beliefs, or something else like that. Someone may want to keep contextualism and relativism separate. For my purposes, I'm not really going to explore that any further. In other words, on the relativist view, I might be justified in believing that some claim P is true relative to certain epistemic norms that I employ, but not justified in believing P relative to various other norms. Right? Another way that relativism is sometimes characterized is that there are different criteria of justification, and none of them are objectively correct or privileged over any others. Is this my view, or at least consistent with my view? Well, it's a bit complicated. It depends largely on whether justified, as we're using the term, is a relational or context-sensitive predicate. Consider, by analogy, the word foreigner. Whether someone counts as a foreigner depends on the context in which the claim is being made or considered. Relative to some country, for example, a certain person would count as a foreigner, but relative to another, they would not, right? So foreigner, in this way, is a relative or context-sensitive predicate. The question is, as we're using the term justified, is it context or relative, context-sensitive or relative in a similar sort of way? But this is just a question of empirical semantics, of how the relevant terminology is being used. As it turns out, I'm kind of skeptical that it's being used in a clear and consistent way. But assessing this, term use is a bit outside of the scope of this video. As I discussed in the video on knowledge and skepticism, what we could do is consider the various ways in which the terms are or might be used and provide our thoughts on each. Some such uses will be relative or context sensitive. Others will not. You might ask then, okay, but what if people use the terms, what if different people use the terms in a non-context sensitive way, but they use it in different ways? If neither such use is privileged over the other, then isn't this just the relativist conclusion, right? No, it isn't, and we have to be careful here. All that's happening is that the same word is being used in different ways. For relativism to be true, it must be that justified is being used in the same way, but that its application conditions are context sensitive or relative. That's not what's happening here. By analogy, if I use the word star in the normal way, and you use it to talk about dogs, it would be wrong to infer some relativist or context-sensitive conclusion about stars. What's relative here is the way the terms are being used, not the correct application of the term on any particular use. Relativism requires the latter. Note the difference between star here and foreigner as previously discussed. The latter is genuinely a relative or context-sensitive term. But the former is not. In sum, then, I'm neither asserting nor rejecting epistemic relativism. I'm just noting that which is the case depends in part on how we're using the relevant terminology. It's in part a semantic question, right? Is the term justified or knowledge a context sensitive or relative term. Okay, I do want to briefly comment on another way the problem of criterion might be stated, as discussed at the outset. We might understand it as the meta-epistemological issue, as in the first statement of the questions. That is, suppose the questions are, which of our beliefs count as knowledge, and what are the criteria for determining which of our beliefs count as knowledge? Well, to answer these questions, I would want to first get clear on how the term knowledge is being used. Once it is clarified, if it is, and if I have a view, I can provide my view on which of our beliefs qualify, if any. On criteria for determining which of our beliefs count as knowledge, I would cite the various methods I use or might use for determining whether the relevant conditions are satisfied. To reuse an earlier example, if counting as knowledge meant, one condition on a belief, or if the condition on a belief counting as knowledge were that it's formed on a Wednesday, I would cite the various ways in which I determine, or might determine, whether a belief was formed on a Wednesday, right? That's how I would ascertain, or attempt to ascertain, what beliefs are knowledge and which are not. The ones formed on Wednesdays are, the ones not formed on Wednesdays are not. Of course, I don't mean to suppose that that's how the term knowledge is being used, but I think that the point generalizes. My response to these questions are actually not different in kind from my responses to the more general problem I already discussed. It's just the more general problem applied to particular claims, right? Claims involving knowledge rather than just any claim whatsoever. I'll now summarize my comments here. The problem of the criterion is a problem of epistemology. How can we ascertain what the good beliefs are and what the good criteria of truth are in a way that doesn't beg the question against alternative views? After discussing the various responses to the problem, including some not discussed by Chisholm and others commenting on the problem, I briefly discussed the notion of goodness, or positive epistemic value, or whatever, assumed here, which I find rather unclear. If it's some primitive normative notion, I don't really understand what's being said and would remain silent on the problem. My general response to the questions would involve first getting clear on how the term good is being used, and if that can be clarified in a way that I understand, I will provide my views on those questions, if I have a view. It might be that my responses will lead to deep and intractable disagreements with others, but this is just a general fact about disagreement, not some deep philosophical insight. If a good criterion, for example, means a reliable criterion, where a reliable criterion is one which generally, or invariably, counts the true beliefs as true, and the false beliefs as false, then I would cite the various, belief updating procedures that I take to be more or less reliable in this sense. Again, others might disagree, or be unconvinced that those are reliable criteria, and they are free to disagree or be unconvinced. I do not have, nor do I think there is, a general procedure that would resolve any null disagreements, be it on some epistemic issue like this, or on anything else. Finally, I'm not committed to the truth or falsity of epistemic relativism, the truth of which I take to be largely a question of whether the relevant terms, justified, good, knowledge, etc., are being used as a relativized predicate, or context-sensitive predicate, which is an empirical question of term use. Normally, I would end the video here, going to the outro. But I want to kind of rant briefly. You might reflect on the criterion problem so described, and wonder why it's led to as much discussion as it has, in the literature. After all, isn't my response here just kind of obvious? Get clear on the questions being asked such that we can understand their truth conditions. Assess whether we think that they're true or not. And if so, how it is that they're true, right? This won't resolve all disputes, right? But we didn't suppose that anything can. If there can be intractable disagreements for which no resolution is forthcoming. If the questions characteristic of the problem are requesting reliable criteria, well, then we can just note, if we want to, what criteria we think are reliable, and so on. Isn't that fairly simple? I mean, what more is there to say? How is such a problem cause as much ink to spill as it has? I mean, in a way, I think this is a bit symptomatic of deeper problems in philosophy. That unclear thinking and unclear language often generates the appearance of deep philosophical issues, when in reality it's little more than sophistry and illusion. There's really nothing here to discuss. Some people are actually fans of this sort of problem, thinking that this is really interesting philosophy and that they're disappointed that it's not received the adequate attention they feel that it deserves. I have the opposite view, that it has had far more attention than I would like it to have. To be clear, I don't think that Roderick Chisholm or others writing on this problem are bad philosophers. They're great. I'm a big fan of Chisholm, generally speaking, and others who have commented on this problem. Nevertheless, I do think, and I do hope, that this problem will be lost among other blunders in philosophical history. Anyway, I think that will do it for today. Thanks for watching, and thanks especially to my current patrons of the channel. That is NinjaBem, Realistic Nihilist, Johnson AV, Felix, Sean, Sully, Joe, and Eddie. Thanks so much, and if you'd like to support the channel and the creation of more content like this, please consider checking out patreon.com/fiction. For everyone else, thanks for watching, subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.